Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The late afternoon sun poured golden light through the living room windows, casting long, lazy shadows across the floor. Lillian sat curled up on the couch, a warm cup of tea cradled in her hands, watching as her two children played on the rug. Their laughter echoed through the house, filling it with a joy that felt so natural, so effortless. She glanced up at the wall where a recent family portrait hung, her, Stanley, and the kids, all dressed in matching white outfits, smiling like a family with no world. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had always believed she was one of the lucky ones. A faithful husband, a happy home, and the kind of marriage that made other women sigh with envy. It wasn't just love between her and Stanley, it was friendship, deep and unshakable. He still sent her good morning texts even though they slept in the same bed. He still found ways to make her laugh even on the hardest days. On their anniversary last year, he had surprised her with a handwritten letter, listing all the reasons he had fallen in love with her. "I choose you again," he had written at the end, and she had believed him. Without hesitation, she had believed every word. The scent of simmering stew filled the house, wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. The kids were too engrossed in their game to notice their father stepping through the front door, his tie slightly loosened, his face brightening at the sight of them. "Daddy!" they squealed, rushing toward him. Lillian watched as he scooped them up effortlessly, planting kisses on their cheeks. It was a simple, familiar scene, but it never failed to warm her heart. Stanley met her eyes over their children's heads, giving her that knowing smile, the one that told her he was exactly where he wanted to be. She stood, walking toward him, taking his briefcase from his hand as he mouthed a soft thank you. Their marriage wasn't perfect, of course. No marriage was. There were disagreements over little things, how he always forgot to take out the trash, how she spent too much time double-checking the kids' homework. But their love had never been a question. Their bond had never been something she doubted. And yet, if someone had told her that, in just a matter of months, everything she believed about her husband, about their love, would unravel before her very eyes, she would have laughed. She would have called it impossible. As they sat down for dinner, Stanley reached for her hand, squeezing it gently before saying grace. Their children, between giggles, mumbled along with their tiny voices, the innocence painting the moment with a warmth that felt untouchable. Lillian glanced at her husband, her heart swelling with gratitude. They had built this life together, brick by brick, moment by moment. And she had no reason, no single reason, to believe that anything could ever break it apart. If only she had known that love, no matter how strong, was never truly immune to betrayal. If only she had known that, sometimes, the most dangerous deceptions weren't the ones whispered by strangers, but the ones hidden behind familiar smiles. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that made it easy to share secrets. Lillian stirred her iced coffee absent-mindedly, watching Katrina fidget across the table. Her best friend had barely touched her drink, her fingers toying with the rim of the glass, as if the words she wanted to say were tangled between her hands. Lillian knew Katrina well enough to sense when something was wrong, but she also knew not to push, not yet. The woman sitting in front of her wasn't the Katrina she had met years ago, full of laughter and sharp-witted comebacks. This Katrina was tired, her usually bright eyes dull with something unspoken. "Lillian," Katrina finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm pregnant." The words hovered between them, heavy and uncertain. Lillian blinked, the ice in her coffee clinking softly as she set her spoon down. It wasn't the news itself that surprised her. Katrina had always wanted to be a mother. It was the way she said it, like it was something she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel happy about. Lillian reached for her friend's hand, squeezing it gently. "That's wonderful, Kat," she said, her voice filled with the kind of certainty she wished she saw in Katrina's eyes. "Who's the father?" The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable, stretching across the small table between them. Katrina swallowed hard, pulling her hand back as she looked away. "It doesn't matter," she muttered, but Lillian wasn't the kind of friend who let things go that easily. "Of course, it matters," she said, frowning. "Cat, whoever he is, he should be here for you. You don't have to do this alone." Another long silence. Then, finally, Katrina exhaled, her voice small and tight, like it hurt to say the words out loud. "He won't even answer my calls anymore." A coldness settled in Lillian's stomach, the kind that came with knowing someone you loved was hurting and you couldn't fix it. She wanted to ask more, wanted to demand a name, an explanation, but the look on Katrina's face stopped her. Instead, she reached across the table again, brushing a tear from her friend's cheek. "Then forget him," Lillian said softly. "You have me. You have us. We'll get through this together." And she meant it. There wasn't a doubt in her mind that Katrina could lean on her, that no matter what, she would be there. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the truth Katrina was too afraid to speak would one day be the very thing to break her. Over the following months, Lillian poured herself into being the support system Katrina needed. She went with her to doctor's appointments, helped her pick out baby clothes, and reassured her every time the fear crept into her voice. She defended Katrina when others whispered behind her back, quick to silence the judgment of those who thought less of an unmarried pregnant woman. Lillian didn't need to know who the father was. If Katrina wasn't ready to share, she wouldn't force her. What mattered was that her best friend wasn't alone in this. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when something felt off. Times when Katrina would grow tense at the mention of the baby's father, when she would glance away too quickly or change the subject with shaky laughter. Lillian told herself it was just the stress, just the pain of being abandoned. After all, if Katrina couldn't trust anyone else in this world, she could trust her. It never once occurred to Lillian that the truth wasn't just painful. It was a storm waiting to shatter everything she had built. And by the time it hit, it would be far too late to stop it. Nursery was almost finished. Soft pastel colors adorned the walls, the gentle hues creating a warmth that made the small space feel like a world of its own. Lillian stood back, hands on her hips, surveying the work they had done. A white crib sat against the far wall, assembled after hours of struggling with screws and instructions that seemed designed to confuse. A rocking chair, one Lillian had insisted Katrina needed, rested by the window, facing the city lights beyond. The room smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings, but there was an undeniable weight in the air. Katrina sat on the edge of the chair, her fingers tracing the curved armrest, her eyes unfocused. "It's perfect," she murmured, but there was no excitement in her voice. Lillian watched her carefully, searching for the joy that should have been there, the giddy anticipation of a mother preparing for her child. Instead, Katrina looked lost, her thoughts drifting somewhere Lillian couldn't follow. "You don't like it?" Lillian asked, trying to mask her concern. Katrina blinked, forcing a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No, I do. It's just—" "I never thought I'd be doing this alone." The words carried the weight of something deeper, something unspoken, but before Lillian could press, Katrina stood abruptly. "I need some air," she muttered, brushing past her. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality, leaving Lillian standing in the half-finished nursery, the walls suddenly feeling too close, too suffocating. Over the next few weeks, the cracks in Katrina's strength became harder to ignore. Lillian found herself constantly reassuring her friend, comforting her through restless nights and unexpected breakdowns. Katrina tried to act like everything was fine, but it wasn't. There were moments when she would zone out completely, staring into nothingness with a sadness so profound that it made Lillian's chest tighten. At first, Lillian chalked it up to stress, to the emotional toll of an unplanned pregnancy. But then there were the nightmares. More than once, Lillian had stayed over at Katrina's apartment, only to wake in the middle of the night to muffled sobs. She would find Katrina curled up on the couch, knees drawn to her chest, her face streaked with tears. "It's just a bad dream," Katrina would say, brushing it off, but Lillian wasn't convinced. She had never seen her friend like this before. It wasn't just sadness, it was fear. And yet, every time Lillian tried to get to the root of it, Katrina would pull away, changing the subject or laughing it off. It was frustrating, heartbreaking even, but Lillian told herself to be patient. Whatever Katrina was going through, she would talk about it when she was ready. Lillian just had to keep showing up, keep proving that she wasn't going anywhere. Then came the day Katrina broke down completely. It had been a long afternoon, filled with errands and last-minute baby preparations. Lillian had driven Katrina home and was helping her out of the car when, without warning, Katrina burst into tears. It wasn't the quiet, restrained crying Lillian had seen before. This was different. This was raw, uncontrollable. She gripped Lillian's arm as if she were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. "I can't do this," she choked out, her entire body shaking. "I don't know how to do this." Lillian held her tightly, murmuring reassurances as she guided her inside. "You're not alone," she whispered, stroking Katrina's hair as they sat on the couch. "I'm here. I'll always be here." Katrina clung to her, crying until exhaustion finally took over. Lillian sat with her long after she had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, feeling something she couldn't quite name, an unease that settled deep in her bones. There was something Katrina wasn't saying, something she was too afraid to admit. And for the first time since this all began, Lillian found herself wondering, was there more to this than she knew? The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the muffled voices of nurses outside the door. Lillian sat by Katrina's bedside, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest as she slept. The labor had been long, exhausting, but in the end, Katrina had brought a beautiful baby girl into the world. Lillian had held the tiny newborn in her arms, feeling a wave of emotions she couldn't quite name, pride for her friend, relief that both mother and child were safe, and something else, something heavier that she couldn't shake. Katrina had barely spoken after the birth, her exhaustion weighing her down, but Lillian had stayed, determined to be there when she woke up. When Katrina's mother arrived, Lillian had excused herself, deciding to step out for a moment, stretch her legs, and grab some food for her friend. She had walked down the hospital corridor with a sense of satisfaction, believing that after everything, Katrina would finally find peace. But as she approached the door on her way back, voices drifted into the hallway, low, urgent whispers that made her footsteps slow. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, hadn't planned to stop and listen, but something in the hushed conversation made her pause, her fingers tightening around the bag of food in her hands. "Have you told Lillian?" The voice belonged to Katrina's mother, laced with quiet urgency. There was a long silence, a silence that felt heavier than it should have. "Mama, please." "No, Katrina. You can't hide this from her forever. She stood by you through everything. Doesn't she deserve to know the truth? Doesn't she deserve to know that her own husband is the father of your child?" The words slammed into Lillian like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had misheard, if her mind had twisted the conversation into something it wasn't, but the pounding in her chest, the cold sweat that broke across her skin, told her otherwise. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She could only stand there, the world around her tilting on its axis, everything she thought she knew suddenly unraveling in front of her. The hospital corridor felt impossibly long, stretching out endlessly before her as she turned on shaky legs and walked away. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away, away from that room, away from the truth that had just shattered her world. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The tears came before she could stop them, hot and relentless, streaming down her face as silent sobs racked her body. Her mind raced, flashing through memories that now felt like cruel illusions. Stanley's unwavering devotion, Katrina's helplessness, all of it tainted by this one undeniable truth. How had she missed it? How had she not seen the signs? But even through the pain, through the betrayal that burned through her like fire, one thing became clear. She couldn't let them see her break. She wiped her tears, drew in a trembling breath, and forced herself to move. When she stepped back into the hospital room, she placed the bag of food on the bedside table and looked at Katrina, whose eyes flickered with something close to panic. Lillian forced a small smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I need to get home," she said, her voice calm, controlled. "The kids are waiting for me." She turned before Katrina could say anything, before her voice could crack, before the hurt could spill out. And as she walked out of the room, her heart hardened with the one decision she knew she had to make. This was the end. The house felt different that evening. It wasn't just the weight of what she had learned pressing down on her chest. It was the way everything around her seemed almost too normal, too undisturbed, as if the world hadn't just collapsed beneath her feet. Lillian walked through the front door, her children rushing to greet her, their little arms wrapping around her waist, their laughter filling the space that now felt foreign. She kissed the tops of their heads, inhaling the familiar scent of home, and for a brief second, she wished she could freeze this moment, hold on to it before everything fell apart. Stanley was in the kitchen, his tie loosened, a glass of water in his hand. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression softening. "Hey, babe, you're home late. How's Katrina?" His voice was casual, effortless, as if he hadn't done the unthinkable, as if he wasn't the reason she had spent the last hour sitting in her car, trying to piece together the life she thought she had. Lillian forced herself to look at him, to take in the face she had once adored, now a stranger in their home. Every word, every moment they had shared felt tainted, but she didn't let it show. "Not yet." "She's fine," she answered, her voice even, betraying nothing. "She had the baby." She saw it then, the briefest flicker in his eyes, something unreadable, something cautious, but he masked it quickly, nodding. "That's great." She must be relieved. He had no idea she knew. Lillian moved through the house with quiet purpose, her mind already made up. There was no room for confrontation, no space for the screaming, the begging, the inevitable lies that would pour from Stanley's lips once the truth was laid bare. She refused to give him the power to twist this into something she had to endure. She had already decided she was leaving. That night. Before he even had a chance to see the storm coming. She put the children to bed like she always did, kissing their foreheads, whispering promises she wasn't sure how she would keep. Then she moved swiftly, gathering the things that mattered, the ones she couldn't bear to leave behind. Clothes for her and the kids, important documents, a few small trinkets that held meaning only to her. Every movement was deliberate, measured, careful. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. She had loved this man. She had built a life with him. And yet, as she packed the last of her belongings, she realized something that should have devastated her. There was nothing left to say. No goodbye. No explanation. Just an ending. The night air was cold as she carried the last bag to her car, the weight of it nothing compared to what she carried inside her. The street was silent, the world unaware of the moment unfolding in the shadows. She strapped her children into their seats, their sleepy murmurs breaking the stillness, and for the first time since she had heard the truth, her vision blurred with tears. Not for him, not for the life she was leaving behind, but for the woman she had been before this, the one who had believed in love and trust and forever. She sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly, taking one last look at the home they had shared. The lights in the bedroom window were still on. Stanley was inside, oblivious, unaware that when he woke up, his world would be as shattered as the one he had destroyed. Lillian inhaled deeply, then turned the key in the ignition. As she pulled away, she didn't look back. Some things weren't meant to be mourned. Some betrayals didn't deserve the grace of a second glance. Morning came with an eerie stillness. Lillian sat in the corner of her father's living room, a cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands. The house smelled of old wood and familiarity, a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling elsewhere. Her children were still asleep in the guest room, their innocent faces undisturbed by the storm that had swept through their lives overnight. She, however, hadn't closed her eyes for even a second. Sleep felt impossible. Her mind replayed everything: Katrina's broken voice in that hospital room, the quiet deception in Stanley's eyes, the unbearable weight of her own silence as she had driven away. A part of her had expected him to call immediately, to blow up her phone the moment he realized she was gone. But hours had passed, and there had been nothing. No frantic messages, no demands, not even a single attempt to reach her. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Was it guilt? Shock? Or was he already trying to come up with an excuse, crafting a lie he thought she might believe? She tightened her grip around the mug, swallowing down the lump in her throat. None of it mattered. She had made her decision, and no matter what Stanley had to say, she knew she could never go back. The silence didn't last much longer. By mid-morning, her phone vibrated violently against the wooden table, the name flashing across the screen like an accusation. Stanley. Lillian stared at it, her pulse drumming in her ears. She didn't want to answer. She didn't want to hear his voice, to be pulled into whatever desperate explanation he had prepared. But she also knew she couldn't avoid this forever. With a deep breath, she swiped the call open, pressing the phone to her ear without speaking. Lillian. His voice was strained, a mixture of confusion and panic. Where are you? What's going on? I came home, and you and the kids were gone. What the hell is happening? She could hear the edge of desperation, the raw emotion bleeding through, but it didn't move her. I know, Stanley, she said, her tone quiet but firm. A heavy silence followed, thick enough to choke on. Know what? His voice wavered, as if clinging to one last shred of hope that this wasn't what he feared. Lillian closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. I know about the baby. The line went completely still. Not even the sound of his breathing came through, as if he had been frozen in place. And then, barely above a whisper, came his response. Lillian, please. She didn't let him finish. Don't, she cut in, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. I don't want your excuses, Stanley. I don't need to hear you twist the truth or tell me it didn't mean anything. I just want you to understand one thing. I'm done. A sharp inhale came through the receiver, followed by the unmistakable sound of him pacing. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he muttered, his voice breaking. I swear to you, it wasn't. Lillian let out a hollow laugh, bitterness clinging to her tongue. And yet it did. She heard the rustling of papers, the sound of something being knocked over. He was unraveling. But she didn't care. Not anymore. You don't get to do this, Stanley. You don't get to betray me and then beg me to listen. I loved you. I trusted you. Her voice trembled for the first time, but she swallowed down the emotion, refusing to let it consume her. And you threw it all away. Another silence stretched between them, but this time it was different. Defeated. Final. Is there really nothing I can say? He asked, almost pleading. Lillian blinked back the sting of tears. No, she whispered, and with that she hung up, letting the weight of everything settle as she placed the phone down beside her. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise higher, painting the sky in soft hues of gold. A new day, a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Lillian knew she would survive. Days passed in a blur of quiet routines and heavy silences. Lillian found herself slipping into the motions of a life she hadn't planned for. Early mornings in her father's house, preparing breakfast for the kids, pretending that everything was fine when in reality nothing felt real. The weight of what had happened sat deep in her bones, a silent ache that never fully went away. She had always believed in the certainty of her life, in the unshakable foundation of her marriage, and the security of the home she had built with Stanley. But now, those things were nothing more than shadows, remnants of a past she could no longer touch. Her father, ever the quiet observer, never asked questions. He simply made space for her, giving her time to breathe, to process, to grieve in her own way. But there were moments when she caught him watching her, his eyes filled with the kind of concern only a parent could carry. And then there were the children, innocent, unknowing. They asked about their father, about when they were going home, and each time Lillian's heart clenched in her chest. She gave them soft, vague reassurances, knowing they wouldn't understand the truth, knowing that she couldn't bring herself to say it aloud yet. But the truth lingered in the air, waiting for the moment it would have to be faced. Stanley, on the other hand, was relentless. The calls kept coming, some she ignored, some she answered, only to be met with desperate apologies, pleas for another chance, promises that meant nothing now. At first, he had tried to explain, to weave a narrative in which he had made a mistake, but never stopped loving her. "It was never supposed to happen," he had whispered into the phone one evening, his voice thick with regret. "I don't even know how it got to this point." Lillian had listened in silence, her fingers gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, her nails pressing into the wood. How it got to this point. As if it had been some uncontrollable force, something that had happened to him rather than a choice he had made. And then, when words failed him, he resorted to what she had expected all along: anger, accusations of her being too quick to leave, too unwilling to fight for their family. "We have children, Lillian. You're really going to let this destroy everything?" That had been the last call she answered. She had simply inhaled, steadying herself, before responding in the calmest voice she could manage, "You already did." After that, the calls dwindled. She knew he wouldn't stop completely, not yet. But for now, there was quiet. And in that quiet, she allowed herself to feel the loss, the emptiness, the sheer exhaustion of it all. Then, one evening, Katrina called. It was unexpected. Lillian had almost forgotten what her voice sounded like, how familiar it had once been, how easy their conversations had flowed. But now, the sound of her name from Katrina's lips felt like a wound being reopened. "Lillian, please," she started, hesitation thick in her voice. "Just let me explain." Lillian clenched the phone in her hand, staring at the dimly lit room around her. Part of her wanted to hang up immediately, to deny Katrina the chance to say anything at all. But another part of her, smaller, quieter, needed to hear it. So she let her speak. Katrina sobbed through her words, confessing things Lillian wasn't sure she wanted to know. "I never meant to hurt you," she kept saying, as if that made a difference, as if it changed the fact that she had taken something sacred and shattered it beyond repair. And then, just when Lillian thought she had nothing left to feel, Katrina's voice dropped to a whisper, trembling with something that almost sounded like fear. "There's something you don't know," she murmured. "Something I never told you about Stanley." The world seemed to still around Lillian, her breath catching in her throat. She had thought she knew everything, but as the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, she realized she had been wrong. And suddenly, she wasn't sure she was ready to hear what came next. The weight of Katrina's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Lillian sat frozen, the phone pressed to her ear, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but her throat felt tight, as if the very act of breathing had become impossible. The silence stretched between them, unspoken emotions lurking beneath the surface, until Katrina finally exhaled shakily and broke it. "Lillian, I didn't just—" She hesitated, her voice trembling. "I didn't just sleep with Stanley once. The confession was like a knife twisting deeper into an already open wound. Lillian shut her eyes, gripping the armrest of the chair as a slow numbness spread through her limbs. She had suspected the affair wasn't a one-time thing, but hearing Katrina admit it, hearing the guilt woven into every word, made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. Katrina continued, each sentence more devastating than the last. "It started months ago," she whispered. "Before I even knew I was pregnant." Lillian's breathing shallowed. Months ago. That meant Stanley had been lying to her, deceiving her, for far longer than she had initially thought. Every stolen glance, every late-night excuse, every moment she had trusted him, all of it had been built on a foundation of betrayal. And then Katrina said something that made the ground beneath her shift completely. "I wasn't the only one, Lillian." The words sent an icy chill down Lillian's spine. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Katrina hesitated, then sighed in resignation. "There were others. At least one that I know of," she admitted. "A woman named Tessa." The name meant nothing to Lillian, but the realization behind it made her stomach lurch. This wasn't just about Katrina anymore. This was bigger, deeper. Stanley hadn't just made a mistake. He hadn't just given in to temptation with a familiar face. He had led an entirely separate existence, weaving a web of lies so intricate that Lillian had never even seen the strands until now. "I found out about her by accident," Katrina continued, her voice thick with regret. "It was months before I even knew I was pregnant. I confronted him about her, and he promised me it was over." Lillian let out a bitter laugh, one void of humor. "And yet he was with you," she said flatly. Lillian felt sick. All those nights Stanley had kissed her goodbye, all those moments he had reassured her, all those times he had pretended to be the man she thought she knew. He had been living a lie, and she had been nothing more than a fool for believing him. The anger came slowly, creeping up her spine like a rising tide, not the sharp, burning rage she had expected, but something colder, more final. She had already left him. She had already made her decision. But now there was nothing left to grieve. No marriage to mourn. No love to salvage. Whatever had remained of her feelings for Stanley, whatever thread of doubt had lingered, it was gone. Completely severed. "Thank you for telling me," she finally said, her voice steady. Katrina let out a broken sigh. But Lillian wasn't interested in hearing whatever apology was coming next. There was nothing Katrina could say that would change what had happened. Nothing that would undo the damage. She simply ended the call, setting the phone down beside her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt free. Not healed, not whole, but free. And for now, that was enough. The night stretched long and silent, pressing in on Lillian like a heavy fog. She sat by the window of her father's house, staring into the darkness beyond, her thoughts tangled in the wreckage of the past few days. The weight of Katrina's confession still lingered, settling deep in her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge. Stanley's betrayal had already felt unbearable, but the revelation that there had been more, that she had only uncovered the surface of his deception, was something else entirely. She had spent the last 10 years of her life believing in a man who had never truly been hers. The realization gnawed at her, leaving a hollow ache where certainty used to be. And yet the sadness that had once consumed her was no longer as sharp. It had dulled, replaced by something steadier, something that no longer clung to false hope. "I am done." The words echoed in her mind, a quiet mantra she held on to. She thought of the love she had once given so freely, the trust she had poured into her marriage, and for the first time, she saw it for what it truly was, a gift wasted on a man who had never deserved it. Morning came with an unsettling quiet, but the world outside continued as if nothing had changed. Lillian's father watched her carefully over breakfast, his gaze filled with the kind of knowing that only came with age. He had never been the type to pry, but as he set his coffee cup down, he finally spoke. "What do you want to do next?" The question was simple, but it carried an unspoken understanding. You can't stay in limbo forever. Lillian let out a slow breath, staring at her hands. "I don't know," she admitted, but even as she said it, she knew that wasn't entirely true. She had already made the first step in leaving Stanley. She had already walked away from the life she thought she would always have. But now, standing at the edge of something new, she realized she had the power to choose what came next. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't bound by anyone else's decisions. Not Stanley's lies. Not Katrina's betrayal. Not the weight of a broken home. She looked up at her father, meeting his steady gaze. "I want to leave," she said quietly, the words settling into place as soon as they left her lips. "I want to start over somewhere new." By the time Stanley finally showed up at her father's house, Lillian had already made up her mind. She saw his car pull into the driveway from the window, and even before he stepped out, she knew why he was here. He wasn't ready to let go. But she was. When he knocked, she didn't rush to open the door. She took her time, steadying herself, ensuring that she felt nothing when she finally faced him. When she pulled the door open, Stanley looked different, tired, unshaven, his usually crisp appearance undone. "Lillian, please," he started, his voice raw. "Just talk to me." She studied him, but there was no flicker of the man she had once loved. That man no longer existed. Or maybe she realized he never had. "There's nothing left to say, Stanley," she said, her voice even. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "We can fix this. We have a family. You can't just throw it all away." Lillian let out a breath, calm, controlled. "You threw it away first." And with that, she stepped back, closing the door between them. She didn't need his explanations. She didn't need his apologies. She was finally walking away, and for the first time, she wasn't looking back. The airport was alive with movement, the steady hum of announcements blending with the chatter of travelers passing through. Lillian stood near the gate, her two children beside her, their small hands gripping hers tightly. The weight of what she was about to do settled over her, but it didn't feel suffocating. It felt right. For weeks, she had prepared for this moment, tying up loose ends, making arrangements, ensuring that when she left, there would be nothing left pulling her back. Her father had supported her decision without hesitation, though she had seen the sadness in his eyes when she told him she was leaving. "You deserve a fresh start," he had told her the night before, his voice thick with emotion. And she knew he was right. This wasn't about running away. It was about reclaiming her life, about stepping into a future that wasn't dictated by someone else's betrayals. She glanced down at her children, their innocent faces reflecting none of the turmoil she had been through. To them, this was an adventure, a new place to explore. And maybe, she thought, that's exactly what she needed too. A chance to rewrite her story on her own terms. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, Lillian took one last look at the life she was leaving behind. Her phone had been silent for days now. No more desperate calls from Stanley. No more hollow apologies from Katrina. She had blocked them both, severing the last ties that once held her captive. It had been harder than she expected, but necessary. She had spent too much time living for others, believing in people who had only ever seen her as an option, not a priority. But that part of her life was over now. She had grieved, she had endured, and now she was ready to let go. The pain hadn't fully disappeared, perhaps it never would, but it no longer had the power to define her. She exhaled, a slow and steady release, as if she were shedding the last remnants of the past with every breath. The unknown stretched ahead of her, vast and uncertain, But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was free. The plane took off, the city shrinking beneath them as they soared higher into the sky. Lillian stared out the window, watching as the world she had once known faded into the distance. Her children were already settling in, their excitement bubbling over as they chatted about their new home, their new school, their new life. She listened, smiling softly, their voices a comforting reminder that she had made the right choice. She wasn't just leaving, she was beginning again. The past had no hold on her anymore. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was all behind her now. Ahead of her was possibility, hope, and a future she would build on her own. And as she leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to embrace it. Because this was the start of something beautiful. Something that was finally hers. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.